Hey, Steve.
Howdy.
How you doing?
Good so far.
Yeah. Thank you for doing this. I
No
appreciate
sweat.
it. I've been...
I was here anyway, as you could tell.
Yeah. In previous interviews. 3 in 1 day. It's very bizarre. I've been thinking a lot about things I wanted to talk to you about. And I realized that over the course of 40 years, you've heard it all. Especially about music and production. Maybe not all, but enough.
A lot.
A lot.
Yeah.
And so, which I totally can imagine is kind of annoying. So I figured, why not talk about things people normally don't talk to you about? Not even like your upbringing and where you came from, because that's happened too. Mm-hmm. But the little things that I kind of appreciate about you as a person, such as like your belief in, I wouldn't say being a purist when it comes to audio or being an engineer, just translating the information for the band. Mm-hmm. But where did that come from? Because I know it's a big part of who you are.
Yeah. I think a lot of my personality, sort of in general, was formed by being involved in the punk rock scene in Chicago when I moved here in 1980. And when I moved here, I saw peers of mine, people who looked like me, people that were my age, people of the same general proclivities, doing all manner of things for themselves. Like they would just put a band together on a moment's notice and put on a show in a loft or in a house or whatever. If they were doing a show at a club or whatever, they would organize everything themselves and take their own, take tickets at the door or whatever. There was a degree of control that everybody sort of had by default because you're doing everything yourself. You end up setting the terms for everything. And I grew to see that as the best way to do everything. And it made me respect all of these people for having the wherewithal to do these things for themselves. And also, like, in those circles, the weirdest shit was sort of accepted as normal. Like you could have eccentricities as a person. Nobody would care. You could be, your music could be like completely unlistenable, freakish stuff. But if you were doing it with an intent, people would listen to it and take it seriously. And people were given a very wide berth to do whatever came to mind in the way that they wanted to do it, right? So I came to appreciate a much wider range of things than I would have if I had had a sort of more scripted paradigm of what music was supposed to sound like, the way bands were supposed to behave, the way people were supposed to behave. So, and part of that experience, part of being in that culture, was being in the company of squares who did not get it, right? And seeing them grapple with people and things and thoughts and sounds and ideas that were alien to them. And the cool ones would sort of observe what was happening, and the not cool ones would sort of react defensively and try to swat things down and try to shut things down and end the scenario, that whatever it was that was confusing them. And so I had a sort of a object lesson there in how not to behave. So when I'm in the studio with a band and they're doing something that I don't get for whatever reason,
yeah.
Like music that sucks, or playing that's awkward or ugly, or sounds that are ungainly or unflattering or whatever, it's not important for me to get it. Like, the important thing is that I respect it and that I allow them to do what they want to do in the studio. And I had seen it. You have to understand that in the 70s and the 80s, it was rare for a band to get to record anything. It was like an unusual and a special thing for a band to be able to record something, even in a sort of a semi-professional thing. Like, just like hauling a 4-track and some microphones into the basement to make a demo tape, that was kind of an effort. There was a lot of effort, and it was kind of an ordeal.
Mm-hmm.
So if a band went into a proper studio, they were doing it on a shoestring at, usually like midnight sessions, on rented tape or whatever, like doing this the most budget setup possible. And a lot of bands in those circumstances were not well served. Like, they would be working at a studio where the engineer was not part of our subculture, did not understand us or the way we valued music or the way we wanted to play. And so those people with the best of intentions would soften a lot of these bands. So a lot of the recordings of that era were not that accurate a representation of what the band sounded like. That was a pretty common thing. You'd hear like that there was this cool band from some other town, and then a recording would finally show up of one kind or another, and it would be unimpressive. And their true fans would be like, yeah, that recording is nothing like the band. They're so much better than that record is,
Mm-hmm.
That was a pretty common rap that you would get. And I saw it in action a few times. Like I observed a few sessions where the engineer for my friend's band, for example, with the best intention, was trying to improve things on a session, but in so doing kind of diminished the band somewhat. So I kind of made it a point in my professional life not to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And if somebody showed up in the studio and they were doing something that I didn't understand or that sounded bad to me, my first instinct should not be to change it and correct it to my taste. But my first instinct should be to respect it and try to make a recording of it that's as flattering and as accurate as I can.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that served me because it means that bands can come into the studio with me, and it's not important for me to like what they're doing or even comprehend what they're doing, but they can trust that I won't interfere with what they're doing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Be a great translator for them. Take what they're doing and just have it properly come through.
Yeah. I mean,
the stereo.
For me, the ideal experience from a technical standpoint as a session engineer is for me to like go in the room and listen to the band playing, or listen to them individually playing, and come in the control room, open the faders, and have it sound like that.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's ideal.
Yeah.
Because then I know that at a minimum we're starting from a place of naturalism. We're starting from a place that respects all of the choices and decisions and creative input that they've had up until that point.
Mm-hmm. So sometimes do you have artists, I'm sure it's happened, come in and they want something more out of you, like not to just be a great person to translate
Not so
the
much that they
information?
want more out of me, but that they do want more out of the session than they're capable of bringing to it.
Yes.
And that's perfectly reasonable. Like, if you want your music to be elaborated on in the studio, and you bring a simplified version of it into the studio where you expect elaboration to happen, I mean, that's a perfectly reasonable assumption, because that's sort of what happens by default in a lot of sessions. But that's rarely comes as a surprise to me. Normally, I'll have a conversation with the band about what they want their record to sound like and what they want to do, and I'll know at the outset that what they're looking for is some kind of a exaggerated or larger or more grandiose experience than they could provide just sort of organically.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very straightforward. Like, if they can describe the things that they like and don't like about their music, then I can help with whatever production decisions they make down the line. But it's rare for me to listen to a piece of music or listen to a band that I'm unfamiliar with and suggest things. Like, that's pretty rare.
Mm. Yeah. Do you find, kind of similar to the first question I asked you, do you find that this mindset of kind of wanting to be, I wouldn't say, again, purist, but a great translator of information, do you find it happening in other parts of your life besides being a recording engineer?
Not really. No, I mean, being an engineer in the studio is a very specific set of skills, very specific problems that you have to solve, very specific obligations on you as a person.
Mm-hmm.
And I see those as being distinct and unique to the job, and I try not to bring the job home with me.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah. When did it become, this is a job that I should not take home with me, versus this is a fun hobby passion that you were probably doing in the 80s when it was not as distinctive of a career path?
In the early 80s, I didn't really make a big distinction between any of these things, like playing in a band, writing music, recording somebody else's music, helping out with a gig, helping out with artwork for a record, participating on a sort of a social level in the scene, going to somebody's house for a party. Like, all of these were all part of the same experience for me. It's like a sort of a broad experience of music, and it gradually fractured as I got more involved with earning a living and actually earning a living and paying my way through life. I didn't have as much free time, so I did fewer and fewer of these sort of helping out a friend kind of scenarios. But I always managed to find a few avenues to do that. Like, right out of college, I had a job as a photograph retouch artist at a photo lab. And that photo lab had big process cameras, so they could shoot large sheets of film, which were, at the time, were how you would make negatives for printing, like printing posters, printing fanzines, printing T-shirts, whatever. All of it started with a big photographic negative. And so I found myself doing that in downtime at work or after hours at work, like shooting films for people for their posters or screen printing or for their T-shirts or whatever. And that was a way for me to do the same kind of like participatory experience that I had when I was putting on shows or, doing artwork for a band's flyers or for their record cover. Or for a very short period, I ran a record label, and I managed to put out a few records on that label. That was all part of the same experience, but I didn't have as much flexibility the more demands were placed on my time, sort of by my job.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually, I had enough work as an engineer that I could quit that job and be fairly certain that, fairly secure for the next several months anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So I did, and then I just never had to get it back again. Like in the beginning, I had 3 months worth of solid work lined up as an engineer past my quitting point.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of that 3 months, there was another 3 months waiting for me. And at the end of that 3 months, there was another 3 months waiting for me. And it just sort of carried on like that. And it wasn't a conscious decision that from here on out, for the rest of my life, I'm going to be a recording engineer. It was just like, at the moment, I have enough work to keep me busy and pay my rent for the next 3 months.
Mm-hmm. So in the 80s, when you were doing all these things, a record label, when you say putting on shows, do you mean like...
As a local promoter. Like, I would book a venue, hire a PA, front the money, print the flyers, wheat paste the flyers up on the L platforms, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Did you do any DIY shows or just strictly at actual venues?
I mean, they were all DIY to an extent. Like, a venue just meant that the venue would let you put the show on there.
Yeah.
They weren't going to give you any money.
Right.
They weren't going to,
Did you do like more like the basements or garages or anything like that?
Everything from loft spaces and rental halls. There was an auditorium, a small auditorium that was owned by the International Workers of the World, the Wobblies Union. They had a building called Lynx Hall where their union headquarters were. There wasn't much going on at the Wobblies at the time, but that auditorium was available most nights of most months. So I put on shows there. That was a scenario where I had to bring in everything. I had to bring in a stage, a PA.
Wow.
There was a concessions booth, so we had people in the concessions booth selling, soft drinks and T-shirts and whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And I did a few shows like that. That was way too much work. I gave up on that.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot of work. I mean, so you were playing music, guitar and bass. You could play both. you're recording songs. I'm thinking mid 80s here. You're putting on shows. You work as someone editing photography or the posters. Sorry, what was it again?
I would do artwork for my friends' bands, just do poster and record sleeve artwork, T-shirt artwork. For a while, I worked at a T-shirt screen printing company, and I would run editions of my friends' bands' T-shirts after hours. My boss said, if you buy the shirts and you clean everything up, you can print shirts for your friends' bands. That's fine. So I would do that,
Yeah.
And then, all of these things, were. And the thing is, like, I wasn't unique in this regard. Like, everybody was doing all of this stuff. Like, I'll use as an example the band Naked Ray Gun, who were friends and sort of heroes of mine.
Mm-hmm.
They had a coach house in Lincoln Park, and their basement of that coach house they sort of noise-proofed it in a kind of a crude way. So they practiced down there. They had a drum kit and a small PA set up down there, and they would practice down there. Every band in Chicago, at one point or another, would practice in the basement of the Naked Ray Gun coach house. Mm-hmm. And the people who lived upstairs in the coach house, Naked Ray Gun, basically just had to put up with it. Mm-hmm. Because Naked Ray Gun had put together this PA to use in the practice space, that PA was also available to use for punk gigs. And so if you wanted to use if you couldn't get a proper PA because you couldn't afford one, Naked Ray Gun would turn up and run sound at your gig, Mm-hmm. So that was the behavior of everybody involved in the punk scene at the time, was that you were all doing everything.
Yeah.
And the same people that were writing the fanzines were the same people that were putting out the records. They were the same people in the bands that were friends of yours.
Yeah.
They would lend equipment to bands coming in from out of town who'd blown up their bass amplifier in Minneapolis. Mm-hmm. Like, it was all the same people.
Like a very do-it-together mentality.
Yeah, and that kind of everybody working on the same project, right? The project wasn't your band or your record or this one show that you were doing. The project was the whole of our underground culture, and everybody was working on all aspects of it at all times. Mm. So, having said that, we're talking about a scene of maybe 200 or 300 people in total in a city of, 7.5 million people in this area. And those people, a lot of them are still at it. And a lot of them, like, they made their bones doing that then and have carried on doing it now. And you run into the same people still involved in the same things around the country that were involved in it in the 80s.
Yeah.
A lot of the same people are still doing it.
Yeah. I mean, that's inspirational. That's great. I mean, this studio and all the work you've done over the last 40 years is an extension of that. Again, it's just like the avenue that started presenting itself for you. But you also naturally had some type of mentality for it, like a skill set. I mean, how else do you come to it?
It sort of didn't matter, though.
It didn't matter?
Yeah, I wasn't good as a recording engineer. I was very much guessing in the beginning, like turn the knob until the needle moves and then just assume that it's moving enough and not too much,
Yeah.
And then listen to it on playback and find out like, oh, no, actually that needle was moving way more than it should have been,
Yeah.
So like that was just my normal behavior, was to just dive in and do things. And then, you make some ugly mistakes in the beginning, and
of course,
over time you gradually build a set of skills that are useful, and you specialize over time. Mm-hmm. Like, I haven't done poster artwork in a while. I haven't done any T-shirts for anybody in a while. So,
now, was this something that you kind of did as a kid? Were you interested in technology or engineering or anything like that? Was that around you?
Yeah, to a very modest degree. Yeah, like I had a Hot Wheels set with a loop-de-loop, and I thought that was impressive.
Yeah.
My brother and I would blow our G.I. Joes up with firecrackers. Yeah, to that extent.
Mm-hmm.
But I wasn't an engineer organically. Like my father and my brother were both had engineering minds. Mm-hmm. And my father and my brother were both professional engineers. My father then taught engineering at the very end of his life. And I wasn't. Like, I was the emotional sensitive kid,
I can relate to you on that one. So it's around you. Engineering's around you, but it wasn't part of your mentality per
No,
se.
I mean, I was a dork. I was a nerd, like any dork or nerd. Like, I got into computer programming when that was like the nerd thing to do. Yeah, built model rockets, shit like that.
Yeah.
But I wasn't a particularly adept engineering mind.
And do you think it branched from playing music?
Everything grew out of being in a band and being surrounded by people in bands and wanting the being in a band thing to be better for everybody. Yeah, all of it grew out of that.
Yeah, that seems to be the case that I've noticed. That's happened with myself, and it's happened with a lot of contemporaries I'm a part of. It starts from like, I just want to play in a band. And then you go, we got to record. I don't want to pay for that.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's spend like a couple $100s on gear and just like start from there. Oh, so-and-so has that mic, so-and-so has this. You start borrowing, kind of like what you were just saying.
Yeah.
A lot of that still holds true to this day. It's just a lot of gear has gotten cheaper and more affordable.
Yeah, I mean, I'm envious, tremendously envious of the capabilities that people can get now versus, the late 70s, early 80s, where like a day in a proper studio like this would cost you a couple $1,000s in like 1980.
Which is a lot.
Which is, I mean,
yeah.
Bear in mind, you could buy a new Mustang for $5,000,
Mm-hmm.
So like on an equivalent basis, we're talking like a day in the studio is something like $10,000,
Yeah. So where did you start acquiring equipment in the 80s? When did you officially start? Like, it wasn't really an official thing. It was more like slowly picking up equipment.
I through that whole period, like starting around 1980 when I moved to Chicago, I first took an interest in it. I started gradually getting equipment together and renting what I couldn't buy, and then eventually get to a point like the first time I had a working studio in my house would have been, I bought a house in March of 1986, March of 1985. And then by the middle of that summer, there was a working studio in the basement.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's in Chicago, you bought one?
Yeah. It was about a mile from here on Francisco Avenue.
Oh, so you've always kind of just been around this area, or?
Yeah, I mean, here and there. When I was in college, I lived in Rogers Park, and then I lived in Uptown for a while. And then I moved to that neighborhood, whatever that neighborhood is called. Old Irving Park?
Okay.
I don't know what that's called.
I'm not too sure. And you went to school at Northwestern, correct?
Yep.
And why Northwestern? Why journalism, correct?
Yeah, when I was in high school, I sort of idealized the notion of journalism as being this like constant truth-telling force for good. Like, and at the time in the popular culture, there was a lot of stuff like All the President's Men, and my heroes were the muckrakers, people like Upton Sinclair and Woodward and Bernstein, who brought the Watergate scandal to light, and people like Ida Wells, who were like the muckraking journalists were sort of shining a bright light on somewhat hidden or deceptively presented corruption and shit.
Mm-hmm.
And so I admired people who worked in newspapers who were not necessarily investigative journalists or whatever, people like Ambrose Bierce and H.L. Mencken and Ring Lardner, who were just great writers. But they worked in newspapers. And so I made that association between writers that I liked and admired and wanted to read and newspapers. And I thought, well, I should just be a journalist.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the time, the journalism schools of good repute were Northwestern University, Columbia in New York, and Columbia, Missouri. I applied to all of them. I got into all of them. And I thought to myself, well, living in New York is going to be very expensive, and that's a long way from home. I grew up in Montana.
Mm-hmm.
Chicago is also a big city. I bet they have a punk rock scene there. That sounds good. And it's not as far. So I picked Chicago for that reason, basically. Seemed like Columbia, Missouri would be moving from one college town in a backwater state to another college town in a backwater state. So,
Yeah, I mean, New York at the time also had a great punk rock scene, right?
yeah, but I was slightly intimidated by New York. Just like the notion of New York in the general populace was that it was this sea of people conspiring to rob you, and
Yeah.
it just seemed intimidating, like to live in such a big cosmopolitan city. Chicago seemed like it was a sort of a midpoint between Montana and New York City.
Yeah. No,
I'm
New York,
very pleased that I ended up here because this was a super vibrant music scene for me to get involved with. Every person that I met in the scene here was in one way or another inspiring, and I don't think I could have done better than to end up here.
I think you made the right choice, not selfishly at wanting to have an individual like yourself in this city, but growing up here my whole life and being here and going to school here and being involved in the music scene, I couldn't agree more. It's such a great city for music and art. It has an insane amount of genres and styles here, and it's a place people grow up, or they go to school and they stay here. It's not like coming here to get famous like in LA and New York. It's very different.
Yeah, a friend of mine had when I was at Northwestern, I had the way the journalism program was structured, you had to have a fairly extensive series of minor subjects, right? So you had to have a technical minor, and my technical minor was chemistry, and then you had to have a humanities minor, and my humanities minor was painting. So my advisor in the painting program was an artist named Ed Paschke from Chicago, who is a visual artist that really inspired me, and his aesthetic was really suited to the time. It was like sort of synthesizing an electric experience or a video experience by looking at paintings that were sort of, the vibrancy of the imagery was underpinned by sort of this visual style that was sort of pulsating with energy from contrasting colors and really vivid, bright, almost fluorescent colors, and really big contrasts and grotesque imagery. A lot of caricature type, almost cartoonish imagery. So I really admired his visual style, and I learned a lot from him about the practice of art. And one of the things, he had this theory, because he had lived in New York for a while, and then he came back to Chicago and much preferred living in Chicago as a working artist. And his theory was that there are these magnet cities like New York and Los Angeles. New York for the visual arts and other aspects of high culture, and Los Angeles for things like movies and television and other kinds of low culture, music industry and that sort of thing. And the way he thought of it was that these magnets, these coastal magnets, attracted the people with the strongest ego about their art, not necessarily the strongest talents in the arts. So his theory was that if you're really good, you can be anywhere and practice your craft, and people will pay attention because you're good at it. And that you are good at it draws their attention. If you think you're good, you might think that you're not succeeding in Iowa or whatever because you're surrounded by all of these fucking bumpkins who just don't get it.
Yeah.
Right? And so then you figure, well, I'm going to go to New York where they'll get me, and then I'll be a big shot. And to an extent, I'm sure that worked for some people. But the way he described it was that New York was the city of runners-up. Like, the people who were really great, they achieved their success wherever they were. The people who weren't that good, no matter where they were in the world, but thought they were really good, went to New York. And so that's the dominant personality type in New York is these people whose opinion of themselves outstrips their ability. And that breeds a kind of resentment, because while you're there, you're no better in New York than you were in Iowa or whatever. and you're surrounded by people who also think they're really good at it.
Yeah.
And so you're going to fail most of the time. And you're going to feel put upon because you're in this very expensive place where you have to do all of these degrading things to make a living. And the whole time you're resenting the experience because you haven't yet been appreciated for the true artist that you are. Like, so there's just these compounding effects of having the ego drive people to New York rather than some other thing. And that's the way he described it to me. I couldn't have articulated it like that. I had spent no time in New York, didn't know that much about it. But the relative music scenes, like if you compare the music scene in a place like New York to a place like San Francisco or Chicago or fucking Minneapolis, New York was full of very strong personalities. Not that deep in the talent bench. Like the bench was not that deep in terms of like greatness.
Yeah.
But there were a lot of people who really wanted to let you know what they were up to.
Yeah.
And I think that tracks with that sort of general arc of what Paschke told me.
Yeah. Wow. I've thought that, but the way you put it was much more eloquent. And it's such a fascinating thought. It's probably why I have a hard time. Like, I've visited both cities and I enjoy it, and I've done some recording in both, but there's something about Chicago, it just feels so genuine, and it feels very, very authentic and raw.
Well, it's like anything else. Everybody's comfortable with what they're familiar
true.
with. Like, if I had moved to New York in 1980 instead of moving to Chicago in 1980, then my formative experiences would have been around that group of people, and I'm sure I would have come up with a worldview that was influenced by that.
Sure.
I'm just grateful that I was surrounded by all of these supportive, cooperative, collaborative people in Chicago, and that shaped me as a person. And I think I am better because of it. I think I am a better, more open-minded, more interested in cooperating person because of that.
Yeah. So you heard that in college, Northwestern. So are you playing music and recording and doing all these things in the art world at the time you were in college?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, from the moment I hit the ground here, I was trying to put a band together, trying to play with people. Yeah, from the minute I hit ground.
And did you find yourself playing in other scenes or working with other scenes, or was it mostly just punk rock?
Yeah, everything that I was interested in was either punk rock or the music that derived from punk rock, like the underground scene that started with punk rock.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a large crossover with the queer underground in Chicago. Like, several of the seminal figures in the music scene and in the punk scene in Chicago were queer, and there was a gay couple that were sort of like that ran Wax Trax Records, and they were sort of like the people that got the ball rolling. Like there wasn't much going on in Chicago until Jim and Danny moved to town and opened Wax Trax, and then that became the Mecca. That became the place that everybody would go to hang out and see what records were in, new records that were in from England. So like, bass player wanted flyers and all that kind of stuff like that. That all happened at Wax Trax. Wax Trax was absolutely the focal point of the punk scene in the early days.
That's not still around, is it?
No.
No.
It was on Lincoln Avenue. It was right next door to the Biograph Theater on Lincoln Avenue.
Oh, okay. And that's in like the early 80s that happened, or late 70s?
It started, I think they moved to Chicago in 78 and opened the store in 79. And I hit town in the summer of 1980, and I was there like religiously every week at least once.
And so when did recording, you have all this information, you get out of college, you're playing in bands, multiple bands, I'm assuming, because everyone does it, and in the beginning days. You're recording, you're doing all this artwork, many different worlds. When do you start working with bands you don't know, and it's not just like friends and in your scene?
I was just talking about this earlier today. The first session that I did for someone who wasn't an immediate friend of mine was for a singer named Robbie Fulks, who I've gone on to do dozens of sessions with. And he's still at it. He's still cranking records out. He was nominated for a Grammy a couple of years ago. The first session that I ever did for a band that weren't immediately in my peer group was for Robbie Fulks. He was working as a paralegal, at a law firm called Jenner and Block, along with a friend of mine named John Bonin, and they were sort of buddies because they bonded over music. And Robbie said he had this band and he wanted to do a demo recording, and my friend John Bonin said, "Oh yeah, my buddy Steve, he built a studio in the basement of his house. He can record your band." So that would have been, like spring or summer of 1985, maybe.
Okay.
I think that's probably 80, maybe 86, but I'm very bad with dates. I'm gonna say 85.
Okay.
And then, like clockwork, every few years, Robbie gives me a call. Hey, let's do a session. And I end up doing another record with him. I've probably done a dozen records with Robbie Folks over the years.
It's so cool when you establish a relationship with certain artists, and not just the work you get from them, but the work they pass on to you from other bands, the good word they put in for you,
Yeah, I mean, the only real influence that you have is, the experience that you can share with other people, right? Like, if you have a bad experience with somebody and you can warn somebody away from them, that's as good as a positive recommendation for somebody else.
Yeah.
Hang on one second.
Sorry to interrupt.
No.
Your files are there. For some reason, I couldn't log in with your credentials, but you were logged in over here, so I made it work. So one day I'll have to ask you about that again. But
Okay.
for now, you've got links. I tested them. They work for the folders. Everybody's got full access. All singing, all dancing.
Excellent.
Yeah. Thanks
And-
very much.
Yeah.
Are you in tomorrow?
What day is tomorrow? Thursday?
Thursday. You don't have anything.
No, tomorrow, I don't believe I do.
Okay. I think we're just waiting on you to confirm Friday morning at 9:30.
I'm in.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
All right. I'll tell everybody you said you're in.
Okay.
All right. Awesome. See you on the internet.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're recording. You're saying that hearing that something or someone isn't good to work with is just as good as hearing they are.
Yeah.
Because it could now put you into maybe possibly the right avenue with someone who might be better to
Well,
work with.
the main thing is that you only have so many bullets when you're in operating on the outside of the mainstream music business, where you're not being underwritten by anybody else. You don't have any corporate entity that has a budget for you. You're literally spending your rent money on this artistic endeavor. You only have so many bullets, and you can't waste them.
Yeah.
So if you do a session with somebody and it sucks and you can't do anything with it, it's worse than just that it sucks. It's that you've wasted the resources that you could have used to do something of value.
Mm-hmm.
It's worse than just having the bad experience. It's having the bad experience and also not being able to rebound or recoup that with another later good experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's that's happened to me enough times to learn not to let that happen, not to do that. And that's such interesting.
That's one of the things that I liked about the close-knit quality of the underground music scene in Chicago, was that everybody had a take on, like, who was good to deal with, who was bad to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
Like, one example, and it was always about sort of major expenses. So major expense would be buying an amplifier, buying a guitar. There were some music shops that you knew if you went in there, you were going to get scalped. So you just didn't go into those shops. Let the suburban parents come in there to buy Johnny's first guitar and let them get scalped.
Yeah.
There would be some equivalent thing like that for, say, a sound hire company. You're putting a gig on in a bar, you're expected to provide a PA, sort of going rate for a one-night PA set up and operated was $200 or $300, depending on who was doing it.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody had the phone number of the best $200 guy.
Yeah.
And then the second best $200 guy. And then the last resort $200 guy,
Which guy were you?
I didn't do live sound.
Oh, you stayed away from that.
Yeah. Or if I did, I would be doing it for free as a fourth resort.
Fourth resort, maybe just doing a favor for a friend that
Of course, yeah.
gives you something in return. You did a lot of that currency, where favor for favor, favor for favor?
No, I mean, it's often described that way, as one hand washes the other, in a sort of capitalist sense. But nobody thought about it like that. Nobody ever thought about it as, I'll trade you this favor for that favor. No one ever,
Right.
it wasn't a transactional existence. It wasn't capitalistic in that way. And I think that also, that was one of the things that created a sort of what I consider a healthy suspicion of capitalism in my mind. And it's put me in the frame of mind where I don't treat people like that for any reason.
Yeah.
Like, a lot of people frame all of their interactions in these kind of transactional ways. Like, the old lady isn't as horny as me, but I let her go shopping on Sundays, so Saturday night's my night. That sort of thing. Like, there's this, you manage the world with these capitalist notions of trade,
Yeah.
and I find that whole idea reprehensible. Like, if you need help with something, I should be helping you because you need help.
Yeah.
It's not that I should only help you if in helping you I can create a debt obligation that I can then call in later to my ultimate benefit. Like, that, to me, that's just a reprehensible way of thinking about people and things and behavior.
Yeah.
And I just don't think that way.
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't agree more. It's something that is hard to explain to people if they don't practice it, if that's not something they grew up doing or don't do naturally, something that feels right to them.
Everyone seems to be encouraged to treat everything like a transaction. And I feel like that's a corrupting influence. I feel like that's like, and it manifests in a bunch of different ways. Like, like somebody needs to take a day off, so they need to get their shift covered, right? Somebody else remembers that they covered for you once already, so you owe them one, so they're not going to do it.
Yeah.
Like that kind of thing. It's just keeping a balance sheet on everybody and trying to keep the books balanced and trying to turn a profit on your relationships. Like, that just galls me. And I whenever I think about operating in the world using those kind of metrics and that kind of thinking, it makes me think less of the people that engage in that regularly. It makes me feel like those people are less than fully human because they're not engaging with people on a human level. They're trying to reduce them to a kind of a model of an economic model of behavior, economic behavior. Like, they're trying to make everything into a market and trying to make everything a trade.
Mm-hmm.
And I just, I'm that whole thing just galls me.
Yeah, and I mean, that's something that you've been strict with and true with. I mean, have you found yourself passing up certain opportunities in your professional world because of that mentality? Or you maybe don't even realize, you just don't care?
I don't turn down paying work often.
Right.
It's happened a very few times when there was some external reason for me to be suspicious of the session, where, like, the session sounded sketchy and it seemed like the money that was being offered wasn't real money, like that sort of thing. I have taken a powder and been ultimately glad that I did for some scenarios like that, or when the people involved are notorious for one reason or another, and I just don't want to expose myself to that kind of notorious problem.
Mm-hmm. When, in the earlier days, was there any specific record that got your name out more? Something that brought you noticed, like, oh, more work is coming, more people are noticing or want to work with me? Anything in particular happen? Or was it just a slow, gradual thing?
Very gradual. I do recall I have been out of work on a professional basis by professional basis, I mean, I quit my job for about 9 months, I want to say, when I got a call to do the Pixies record that I did. And that was the first time that a band had been sent to me by a record label.
How'd they hear about you? If you were...
The band were unfamiliar with me.
This is Surfer Rosa.
Yeah.
Okay.
The band were unfamiliar with me. I think they educated themselves by listening to some records or whatever once my name came up. But I was kind of foisted on them, to use a Larry David term. I was kind of foisted. And the foist came from Ivo Watts Russell, who was the guy that ran their record label, their English record label, 4AD. And at the time, my band Big Black was more well-known overseas than it was in the U.S., more well-known outside of Chicago than in Chicago, more well-known in the underground than the mainstream. So it makes sense that this band from Boston, who were sort of conventional, normal people, not deeply embedded in the underground music scene, just normal people, it makes sense that they would not be that familiar with me. And it also makes sense that their English record label guy would be familiar with me,
Right.
since he worked in the independent label scene in England, which was a much bigger deal than in the U.S. at the time.
Yeah.
And then he foisted, and we got along. We had a couple of conversations prior to me flying out there, and we talked over the kind of record they wanted to make, and I did what I could. They were a very good band at the time. They were very well rehearsed and they had their shit together. Their aesthetic was very strong. Like, they knew what they wanted things to sound like.
Yeah.
And I think I did influence that session more than I would now. For example, there were moments in their music where the guitar was meant to sort of blow up and get big.
Yeah. But
they were using these kind of dinky practice amps, kind of modest equipment. And so I suggested, for these big parts, why don't we rent a couple of Marshalls and have you guys play like just a bigger sound? And they were into that idea, so we did it. But it definitely that idea came from me.
Yeah.
And so I like that's more of an intrusion into the aesthetic of the band than I would be comfortable making now.
No, yeah. More just of a curious mind back then, just trying to
I think it was more I just wanted to prove my worth.
Oh, yeah.
Like, it was one of the first records I'd done for people that weren't friends of mine already.
Right.
And
that's crazy. It's only a couple years into doing this.
Yeah. And
that's wild.
I think I wanted to have an influence on the record, and I wanted that influence to make it seem like it was worth paying me.
Yeah.
Otherwise,
Well, I think you did that.
I didn't want them to feel like they were wasting their money, basically. It wasn't that much money, but it was enough that it was like, that's a month's rent for somebody. I don't want them to like feel like they just blew it.
Yeah.
Right? So I was probably outside of my lane more on that record than I was on any record subsequently.
Mm. I mean, I would say it's a good thing you were, because it seems like that record got you a lot more work in life.
To an extent, over time, it's definitely been recognized as a good record. And I at the time, I thought it was a good record. I thought they were a good band. Not like from a musical standpoint, not 100% my cup of tea, but
Yeah.
I was impressed by Charles as a songwriter. I was impressed by the band, the way the band played together. I was very impressed by Kim Deal as a singer, and I thought her melodic sense was really great and unique. But I think it was sort of rookie behavior on my part, a lot of it. And, I can't say that I made the record better. I know that the record is different than it would have been otherwise.
Yeah.
But they were, like I said, they were a good band.
Yeah.
And the previous record, their demos and the LP that came out previously, Come On Pilgrim, like those were both solid.
Yeah.
And I had nothing to do with any of that. And they're very similar, very much of a type with their first album.
Yeah.
So I can't really take any credit for that band being good.
Right. Just the right people hear it and your name's associated with it, so they reach out to you. And
I've gotten a lot of credit over the years for records that were good, that would have been good no matter who was in the engineering chair.
yeah.
You know?
Any ones you care to mention?
Like, I did a bunch of records with the Jesus Lizard.
Yeah.
They were an absolutely impeccable band. Fantastic musicians. And I did a bunch of records with them because we were friends and we were in the same peer group, and it was easy and facile. I don't know. Anyway,
Asking the wrong person.
It was easy for them to work with me because I knew them already. We could communicate as peers.
Yeah.
And I did a good job on those records. Don't get me wrong. I'm proud of having been associated with those records. But if you listen to the record, they did a record immediately afterward that was another guy, another engineer with completely different aesthetic, completely different working methods, and that record's just as good.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like there's nothing magic about me working on those. When a good band goes into the studio to make a record, it's going to be a good record.
You're right.
You know, and I've gotten a lot of sort of, the way I described it once was that, like, whatever glow I feel about having done a good job on these records, it's ultimately reflected light from somebody else being really fucking brilliant, you know?
Yeah.
And that's true every time I make a record. If the record comes out great, you know, the best that I can say is that I didn't impede that performance.
Yeah. I love that philosophy a lot. I try, something that has only like always made me intrigued by you as an engineer has been feeling that way before I even heard about your music or realized the records you worked on that I grew up listening to, the movies they were in, things like that, and being like, man, I really like the sound of this. It feels like it's just translating what the band already can do in a very pure and transparent way, like a very nice way. Not polished, not all this other things going on. Like the biggest one that I always enjoyed, and I know it's a big one, but I just grew up listening to it, are the 3 Nirvana records. Mm-hmm. And you hear Nevermind and you're like, this doesn't make sense for this band. It's too much. It's too crisp. It's too produced. It's too big of a budget. Mm. And I hear in Utero, I'm like, this sounds like how the band always would be playing, how they're very raw, very straightforward, and very honest, just very honest.
Well, I mean, it's nice that you say that. I try not to be critical of other people's recordings. And I know there was, the Nevermind record was recorded with Butch Vig,
right,
who was the go-to guy in the Midwest at Smart Studios for all the bands in Wisconsin, like all the Milwaukee and Madison bands, and a lot of Chicago bands would make the trip, and some bands from Michigan would make the trip to Madison, Wisconsin, and record with Butch. And he did a great job on all of those records. Like, if you listen to any of those records that he made in the mid-'80s, the Killdozer records, Laughing Hyenas records, De Kreutzen, any of those, the Appliances, who were like local heroes in Madison, if you listen to any of those records, they're impeccable. Mm-hmm. You know, they sound like the band. They're energetic and powerful and clean, but the energy of the band and the enthusiasm that the band felt for their own music, like you catch their mania from those records, right? And that's the sign of a very good engineer. And I think Butch is an excellent, he's a master engineer. I think the recordings that he did for those bands captured those bands perfectly and let me hear what they were trying to do, right? That's the whole job. So I'm confident that the record that Butch made with them reflected their intentions. They were told by their label, as a condition of their record being released, that it would have to get mixed by a professional mixer if Butch was going to record it. Because at the time, Butch didn't have much of a CV. He didn't have much of a credit list. And so they had a professional mixer mix that record, Andy Wallace, and they picked him literally because he had done a Slayer record. And they were like, well, that's as near as we can get. Yeah. So let's have him do it.
Yeah.
Unfamiliar with his music, any of the other pop music that he'd worked on, just he did a Slayer record. So let's give him a spin. And the final result is quite a bit more polished than the records that Butch was making when left to his own devices.
Got it.
So I'm not making excuses for that record. I'm saying that record reflected the band's aesthetic, and it was obviously hugely successful.
Yeah.
So I'm not second-guessing their success. But I did get a chance to hear, when I was working with Nirvana on the In Utero record, they had a cassette dub of the rough mixes that Butch had made of this of the original session for Nevermind. Like he had made he made a mix for them to listen to so they could hear their work.
Yeah.
And that cassette was what they referred to within the band whenever they wanted to listen to those songs. The final released version was obviously the final released version, but that one was sort of an afterthought as far as they were concerned, because the session that they did with Butch was the whole show. And I did get a chance to hear that cassette. They played it in the studio, and I thought it sounded fantastic.
Man, that's awesome.
You know, I don't know this for sure, but I would imagine that by now that version has been released in some form or another. Like, I'm sure that it's kicking around somewhere, like some record store day release or something. There's got to be a version of it out there.
That sounds like something that would happen now for extra money. Did something, I think I read this somewhere, did something similar happen with the mixes for In Utero? No, so you mixed it and they kept that version?
We mixed the record. We recorded and mixed the record in one session. Then they took it back with them to Seattle. Kurt spent some time listening to it and had a couple of reservations on his own. And the band wanted to remix a couple of songs. I didn't want to get involved in it because I thought that it had the risk of sort of cascading into a thing where we would end up having to redo the whole record.
Right.
So I said, look, if you want to remix some of these songs on your own, you have my blessing. It's none of my business. It's your record. You should do what you want.
Yeah.
I feel like I did the best I can, and I should be done with it. So they remixed a couple of songs. I think a backing vocal was added to one song. I'm not sure about that. And then the final record that went into the store was the album as we recorded and mixed it, plus these two songs that had been remixed, which were also characteristically released as singles off of the album. So none of that was out of line or weird or offensive to me, but it was played up in the press as being a kind of a salvage operation because the record label people and the management people and everybody were not into that record. They thought it was a mistake to make a kind of a brutal record like that, and they were defensive about their wisdom. And their wisdom was, no, you should do another record with Butch and Andy because that one was a big, successful hit record. And since then, we've done a bunch of other records with Butch and Andy, and those have been big, successful records. So we think you should go do the big, successful record with Butch and Andy. And that didn't happen. And I think that represented a kind of a threat to the power structure. And so all the people involved were kind of sandbagging on that record. All the record label people were kind of sandbagging on that record. And, it was stressful for me to have people in the press, off the record saying that I've ruined a record for the most important band in the world. Like it's stressful and irritating. And it, I paid a professional cost for it, but I also...
Like people didn't want to work with you? After that?
Big record labels is specifically told artists that they were not permitted to work with me on their records.
Really?
Yeah.
That record did well, though.
It did well in the long term. In the immediate term, it was a bit of an embarrassment to the record label that they had to go through all this falderall. And also, it sort of escaped their control, and it was in their best interest not to let a record that escaped their control be a huge smash or be perceived as a huge smash. So they took the money when they sold the copies, but they didn't want it to be. They didn't want it to be perceived as a smash. And I mean, it's all water under the bridge. I could give a shit now. Like my relationship with the band survived. I liked and admired the band then. I like and admire the band now. It was an awkward period where their record label was kind of scapegoating me. That record label doesn't even fucking exist anymore. All those people are out of music. They're all selling real estate. I'm still here making records every day. I could give a shit.
Yeah. I mean, that's amazing. I respect that. I mean, you did what you know how to do. You got that job because you did well with other records, and you've been doing it since. And you're known for just kind of like, it seems like your mentality of how you treat recording, you also treat it with the ethics of the financial part of royalties, of bands, you not taking anything but the initial payment for what they pay for your service when they come here or when you might be hired to go somewhere else.
Sure.
And I've always been of that philosophy too in the work that I do. Have you had a hard time explaining to people that are like, Steve, you could maximize on this or this or that?
I mean,
because I get it and it's annoying.
Well, people who aren't deeply involved in the scene, people who aren't involved in music, are quick to have opinions about me and how I do things. Other people who are, versed in how record deals work, they get it. There are some engineers who think I'm a fool for not taking the money that's being offered to me, but they understand it. They get it.
Yeah.
It's like the game is rigged against the bands.
Yeah.
And if you're playing in a rigged game, one sort of game theory perspective is that you should try to maximize your expectation in that game because that game is rigged. It's not like the band is going to get a fair shake if you do this, martyr yourself in this way. Mm-hmm. But there really is a zero-sum game in play here, which is that most records on most major label records are made under contractual terms that ensure that the band will never recoup, never on paper at least, the band will be in the hole for the duration of their career, right? So the band will never see any royalties, right? Operating on that premise, you should be fucking them whole dong the whole time because it's not going to make any difference. Like, get every penny that you can get, every, advance from record one, doesn't matter if it's recoupable. They're never going to see a penny. Get every penny you can get. That's one sort of game theory way of thinking about it. The other way of thinking about it is that I've worked on some pretty big records, and those pretty big records for sure have recouped their costs and are earning royalties for those bands. And Nirvana was certainly going to be one of those. We kept the costs of the record, extremely low, which meant they were in recoupment very early, which means that every dollar that I didn't get in royalty is another dollar that the band got. It's just a zero-sum thing. Yeah. If I got a point of royalties, that's a point of their income that they're losing.
Yeah.
Right? And I feel better about that relationship, knowing that they are getting all the money that they thought they had coming. That I'm not, whoever else is involved might be attaching some money of theirs, but not me.
Yeah.
I feel good about that. I feel good about knowing that they're getting every penny of the money that they have coming to them, and I'm not siphoning any of it off.
Yeah.
And that's true for the other, the big records that I've worked on. And I feel good about that. I feel like that's, there's money that I didn't get.
Yeah.
But also that money went to somebody who deserved it.
Right.
Right? Whereas in an alternate universe where I did take every penny that I could get and I did attach royalties to all of these records, for most of the records that never recouped, it wouldn't have made any difference because I wouldn't have made anything in royalties if they remained unrecouped.
Yeah.
For the small number of records I did that were hugely successful, I would have made some more money, yes, but then the people who deserved it most wouldn't have gotten it.
Right.
And that, I can't feel good about that.
No, I coming up in a very hardworking DIY mentality in the music and art scene, and you doing that too, myself and you doing that on your own, I think that's where a lot of that came from, and it has to, because some people I know who don't come from that mentality, who didn't come putting on those shows, cutting those posters, playing the bands, recording for free, lugging gear around, doing some really crazy stuff just to get by. They don't get it, and they look at everything as a way to make money. How do I, like what you were saying earlier about, people not getting it and wanting to make money off you, whether it's a record executive or, it doesn't matter, but I don't know what it is, but it seems like anybody I know that came up through life in that mentality has no problem with that moral ground. They know how to just do the work they can do, not try to rip off other people, and just be the best at what they do instead of like just riding on the success for somebody else.
I mean, it's another angle of capitalism, which is where you're trying to, in the perfect capitalist is completely makes as much money as possible, and the people that he's making the money from, he's not interested in their well-being. He's just interested in how much money can he extract from them, right? And that's a relationship that's fine if you're just extracting from a scenario. But I still feel like I'm a participant in the scene. I feel like I'm one of them.
Yeah.
And what I don't want to do is weaken that scene. I don't want the whole of the music community to suffer for the sake of my individual benefit.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. It's a very strict way. Well, it's perceived as being a very strict way to live, but it comes naturally. It seems so fair and right.
It's normal in every other aspect of your life.
Right.
Like every other thing that anybody does for a living. Like the obvious example is like you need your hair cut, so you get your hair cut. The barber doesn't get a royalty every month until you get your next haircut.
Yeah. Yeah, no, the music industry is so weird with royalties and people taking the money from it. I have a YouTube channel with a bunch of videos on it, and the second I was able to monetize on it, once you get like 1,000 subscribers, I turned it off because I absolutely hate advertising and any company associated with it when it comes to taking advantage of the bands that come through that I film and record and the work I put into it. I just take the small fee they charge, but everything else they have, I give them the video, the audio, whatever, and I don't make money off the monetization or have commercials. And so many people have asked me, like, why don't you do that? You can make money, like monetize it. I'm like, no, first of all, I don't want to support the advertising industry or YouTube. I'm going to use YouTube for free to get this word out, but I'm not going to support money they'd make off me or the artists that come through. And I just don't agree with it. I don't agree with taking money from something I didn't do. It just forever, money just rolls into my bank account from doing nothing.
Yeah.
I already got paid for my service.
I have very little problem with the YouTube monetization for one reason, and that is that I have a thing on my computer that everybody could have on their computer that makes it so I never see those ads. So my viewing experience on YouTube is ad-free, and that's fine. That's awesome. And I think as those ad-blocking technologies become more ubiquitous, it's going to be odd. It's going to be abnormal for anybody to see an ad.
Mm-hmm.
Because, literally, if you search AdBlock Plus and click download, then you'll never see another ad. And I think that's an amazing technology that makes the experience of using the internet that much better. And so I have no problem with ads being on YouTube videos, either as a viewer or as a content provider, because I know that it is trivially easy to avoid them ever interfering with my experience.
Yeah, it's just the one place where I get to say, like, no. Like, I have the control of that. I don't want anything to do with it, regardless of that technology, which you're absolutely right. I
think that's reasonable.
Yeah.
I mean, your take is reasonable and noble. I prefer having the money and also not seeing ads. And as it turns out, I can do both.
What time is it?
Yeah, I should probably get going here.
Okay, yeah, we're at... Well, in wrapping, Steve, I learned a lot about you that I was not able to find on the internet. So thank you for being honest and for sharing yourself with me and letting me into your beautiful studio. I appreciate it.
No sweat.
And just keep doing what you do. I respect it.
All right, on those instructions, I will.
All right, take care. Bye. All right, Steve, thank you.